Athman Mohamed. I'm a director with the Trademark East Africa. I actually came in through another event that happened in December and April 2011. I was home on leave in December and I was bored, and there was this World Bank competition called Apps for Development. And because I was driving my wife crazy, I actually entered that competition just to find something to do. And by chance, I won honorary mention in that competition, which meant basically going to meet the World Bank president in Washington, collecting the prize, etc. It was there that I actually met a group of guys who later were the ones who introduced the idea and what was happening in this open data initiative in Kenya. I was not aware of it prior to that. But I had a lot of interest in data. I've been working in the areas of data collection, analysis, etc. for about 7 years now, different organizations. I'm mostly in the trade and transport facilitation area, so it was something that I was very interested in. A few months after the award ceremony in Washington, that was in April, these guys that I'd met from the World Bank came over, and I met them over coffee, and they mentioned that they were actually here to see how they could participate in the ongoing activities that were already happening with regards to the Open Data Initiative. And they asked me whether I would be interested to see what it was about. And of course, I was, because of all this background I've just told you. We then had a meeting with a number of persons. There's a Mr. Alkags, Mr. J. Bala, and Mr. Kaushal from the World Bank Washington at my offices, where we basically discussed the initial approach of how this could be done. And I think from there, that's when I really committed myself to this process. Yeah. I was not aware of the time frame by the time I committed myself to it. It was only after the first task force meeting in the ICT board when we were informed that the president had committed a date to launch this within a span of 6 weeks. And it was actually a race to make Kenya one of the first countries in the developing world to get this done. I think our competition was India, if I was not wrong, and another country. In that first meeting, a task force was formed. Different people were there. We had people from the private sector. We have people from the private sector associations, KEPSA. We had people from the World Bank. We had people from the ministries of education, and a number of technology personalities in Nairobi who had volunteered their time to be there. The task force was divided into a number of units. One unit was handling the technology side of it. The other unit was handling things like collection of the data that needed to go up. Another unit was handling the event preparation, etc. And we basically came up with a work plan of how we would get this done within those 6 weeks. And at that meeting, I was given the privilege of actually heading the technology and usability unit. So the 6 weeks were very hectic, a lot of sleepless nights. A lot of people volunteered their time, energy, and money. There are a lot of quick decisions that had to be made, which were very controversial and which caused a bit of a problem. I remember one of the most difficult decisions to make was the hosting of this platform. Now here we were in a scenario where we had 6 weeks. We didn't have the technology in country to actually support the kind of analysis and hosting of the data that was expected of the platform at then. So that left the only option of, if we wanted this to be done and hosted in Kenya, we have to develop everything from scratch. So the big question was that possible, right? Within the 6 weeks, it wasn't. So we explored a lot of technology options, and we finally found one which actually covered about 80% of our requirements, and that's what we went with. The mandated role as the head of the lead for the tech and usability team was actually to coordinate various functions of that. There was the hosting of the data, there was the look and feel, There was the actual development, because now we're using an outsourced platform, which we had to create our own Kenyan brand and link it to that and make all these things work in a way that was user-friendly within a few weeks. That was my main focus, and I think my role was mostly to coordinate a lot of the activities that the team members in the tech usability unit were doing. But at some point, I think I overstepped my boundaries, because a lot of the other work that the other units were doing was very tightly coupled with what we were actually doing day to day. And from time to time, my coordination role went a little bit further. So I was actually coordinating a little bit of data work, for example, but most of it was done through the World Bank personnel, etc. So it was mostly a coordination role, making sure that we stuck within the timelines that we had set to get this thing delivered, because the deadlines were not shifting and they were not negotiable. So it was only not myself who spent a lot of sleepless nights. I think everybody on the team did that. There were some tasks which I literally forced down the throat of people. For example, getting apps developed so that they can use the data, so that we can showcase how this data can be used at the launch date. That was a task that I really pushed for, even though people didn't like it. There was the role of playing the devil's advocate and actually saying we can't do that at this point. For example, there was this argument that we needed the site to be bilingual in English and Kiswahili, which actually is the way it should be. But given the short time frames, I mean, we had to choose one language to go for launch, and the other had to be a phase 2 or something. That was a difficult decision to convince people, but eventually we did get that done. We had a task force meeting that evening, and the permanent secretary, Ministry of Information, was actually chairing that meeting as usual. And he came in looking very sad. And the first thing he told us is, whatever I'm going to tell you now, don't be worried. And there are actions that we are taking to actually try and resolve this situation. And then he told us that there were a bit of clarifications needed from the Office of the President on what this open data thing is. The President was still fully supporting the initiative, but before he could actually confirm the launch, there were a few questions he needed answered. So in that regard, we were requested, myself, someone called Dennis Gikunda from Google, the CEO of the Kenya ICT board, Mr. Kukubo, PS Ndemo, and the Minister for Information, Pogisio, Honorable Pogisio, sorry, to be at Harambee House the next day in the morning, because we are going to have a meeting with the President in his boardroom to explain why the launch should go ahead. The next day, of course, as is usual of me, I think I underestimated the traffic going into town. So I'm embarrassed to say, but I was actually about 30 minutes late for a meeting with the President. So we had the team already there. They were making frantic calls, where are you? And I reached Harambee House only to find I was not the only one. Dennis Gikunda was 35 minutes late for a meeting with the President. But luckily, he was caught up in some other discussions, so it sort of ate up that time. And we managed to get in after all the security checks, etc. We did our setup in the boardroom, and we waited for him to come. He eventually showed up with his usual delegation. I remember Ambassador Madhaura was there, Professor Saitoti was there, and a few other VIPs were there. And basically, we started the presentation. My voice usually goes low when I'm doing interviews or presentations. There were no mics. So he practically had to stop me and tell me, typical fashion, like, kama unasema kijana, sema tu, ongea, siogope. It made me even more nervous. We basically tried to explain what this thing was about. Tried using examples to show him the benefits to the country, how this data could actually be used to define policies, for example, and then continually be monitored to define whether those policies that were introduced are actually working, or they just created more problems, or they move a problem from point A to point B. At some point, I handed over the floor to Mr. Dennis Gikunda, and he was showing some of the interesting visualizations that we had done for the launch by then on the Google platform in health, education, etc. And apart from that, we also showed him a bit of other possibilities that could be there. For example, integration with things like Google Apps, Google Maps, etc. And the meeting went from taking 1 hour to about 3 hours. At the end of it, he was very happy, very excited. Finally, the clarifications he sought were answered. And basically, it was a go for the launch the next day. So we went back to the waiting room outside the boardroom, and the permanent secretary, the Minister for Information, went in with him in his office just to work out the final details. And he showed up for the launch the next day. I overheard something that I probably shouldn't have heard, but it was an issue of why are we opening ourselves up so much. There was this fear that opening up this government data might create problems, political problems, if any of the data was wrong. And there was the fear that this information could be misused. What I overheard basically, and I won't say who I overheard it from, was there are a lot of these organizations out there, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which actually thrive on creating sensational pieces of news out of misinformation. And the worry was that this was going to give them ammunition. But in that same conversation, I overheard a counter-argument that actually opening up this data is supposed to curb that sort of behavior, because now everything is transparent. They just can't quote their figures from anywhere. I mean, everything is already out there and well-known and publicized, so they actually would be called to question to verify whatever claims they made. So my feeling was that was where the reservations came from. And we know the political temperament here has not been quite settled since the last elections. So everything comes under a very strong magnifying glass, and I think that's really what happened. I don't think there was any reluctance on the part of the Kenya government to actually release this data, because this data, if you look at it, is already released. It's just that the format was different. The fear was that now that it reaches more people, what are the implications? I've been working mostly in the areas of trade and transport facilitation. We have some of the largest costs of logistics in the world. It takes about 2.5 times more to take a 20-foot container from the port of Mombasa to Kampala than it costs to take that same container from South America to Mombasa. I mean, that's ridiculous. Now, someone has to pay this cost. And if the transporter is incurring costs because of delays, because of lack of information, because of inefficiencies on the transport corridors, he's not going to keep it to himself. He's going to pass it on to the importer. The importer passes that cost on to the distributor. The distributor passes it on to the retailer. The retailer passes it on to you and me. You find that it's so ridiculous that if you buy anything in Kigali today, 40% of that cost is actually transport costs. So you buy a lollipop, you give it to your son, 40% of the cost of that lollipop is transport costs. And that's not the way it should be. And that's because there's no information. So the kind of work I've been doing is actually using data to try and identify where these inefficiencies are. So you go for, let's say, the port of Mombasa, you collect all the information they have on their transit goods, going to landlocked countries of Uganda, Kigali, and even Bujumbura and DRC. You go to Kenya Revenue Authorities and collect the same information because they monitor what happens from the gates. They actually authorize the release of this consignment from the gate of Mombasa and monitor all the way to Malaba. So they have a lot of information on what happens there. If you go to the weigh bridges, they can give you a lot of information on what happens at the weigh bridges. And these are the points where these goods pass. If you cross over into Uganda and you talk to Uganda Revenue Authority, they can give you similar information, and so on and so forth until the end of the chain. If you combine it, because you can, using container numbers, truck registration numbers, bill of lading numbers, these are unique identifiers for a consignment, you find that you are able to track the movement of a particular container from the time it landed on the quay at Mombasa to the time it was opened at destination. And if you have the timestamps, you can tell exactly where and when and how long it stopped. Now, if you have a large enough sample for that, you're able to see trends. You're able to see most of the containers stop at Mariakani. So what does that imply? That implies the government has to come up with a policy to make Mariakani more efficient so that the time spent is less. Yeah. If you come to the border and you find that a container takes even up to 2 days just to cross over from Kenya to Uganda, that means something needs to be done at the border. Now, if you reduce this number of days, what you're actually doing is you're reducing the cost of anything that is being carried. And the reduction of that cost actually leads to the reduction of the cost of doing business in the region and the cost of goods. So that 40% of that lollipop now becomes 20%. That's quality of life, that's poverty eradication, that's a whole lot of other things. And you can see it starts from a simple data analysis. You're just combining information from one source to the next source to the next source, using the results to lobby for policy change. Once the policies have been changed, you try to see whether they have the desired impact. And that's really the honey that drew me to the Open Data Initiative in Kenya. When I was asked, would you want to be a part of it? This is the driving reason. Because I knew if you expose information on education, information on health, information on any ministry, you're actually touching people's lives. And you can actually touch people's lives just through data. That's the beauty of it. If you want to convince any human being right now to take an interest in something, you have to show them two things. You have to show them the value to themselves, right? Otherwise they will never bother. And sad as it is, you have to show them how easy it is to do. I mean, that matter right now, if I tell you let's build a building, yeah, it's gonna make you so much money, but then I tell you it'll take you 7 years to do it, you will never jump into that deal, right? But if you come with an argument where you tell them, see, you already have these things. If you expose them, this is the value that you're getting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how it will help you operate faster. There is the value that you are giving, which is part of your mandate. Governments are here to give value to the citizens. So if you can show them that, they will listen. Right? And if you show them how easy it is, which is the second aspect of it, they will give you. One of the easiest strategies I use is to just ask for what I need. Right? You have all this information, I don't need all that, I just need this. Give me this, I'll show you what value I can give you, then I will ask for more. The other way to make it easy is you ask for information that is not confidential. It's already out there in the public domain, you're just asking for permission to repurpose it. Or if it's not out there, you're asking for information that cannot cause any sort of political upheaval, or so you keep it simple. I think that's what I would say. Just keep it simple and people will listen. Show them value and they will give it to you. And once you show them that value, that's like giving them a little bit of honey. They will come back for more. And that's what is happening in the kind of, that's the strategy we have taken. Now, of course, value can be shown individually or in a group. Right? So you start with the individual value to that particular organization, and then you start showing them the bigger picture. Like if you did this with that other partner, this is the additional value you get. Why don't we help you to link up and do it together? And that's what we do. We are facilitators. None of these projects are actually our own. We find organizations who are interested in doing them, support them to do it, then link them up to people who have similar interests and support the bigger group to do it, and we keep growing it like that. I walked into the hall and it was amazing. I didn't expect the turnout to be that much, but I think the interest was clear. A few things went wrong, but of course everything goes, a few things always go wrong in such huge events. For example, we had planned to do a live launch through some sort of mobile device that the president could use actually to go through some of the applications that were developed. That never happened. A lot of interesting speeches. Remember in particular P.S. Ndemo's, his points on Kenya moving towards becoming a knowledge society, that really resonated with me, because I could see how the data connection to the livelihoods of Kenyans. I already understood that link, so when I had that, I knew I was actually thinking the same way that he was. It was very interesting to hear from the Vision 2030, how they saw this as an opportunity for Kenya to move into issue-based politics, for example, which is again another thing that is very close to my heart, using data to actually debate issues as issues and not to be just emotional and just shoot in the dark and hope something will work. That was something interesting. I think the major surprise was when the president actually announced that this should be used as an opportunity to improve issues, simple issues like bringing down the costs of internet connectivity, etc., so that this can spread out more to the masses. I got a lot of positive feedback after. This was a testament to the organization team actually and the task force as to how that event went. Because of my role as the technical lead, I was very, very less involved in the planning of the actual event, but I think it was really a fantastic team effort there. To be quite honest, I think it's typical when you launch something new, you don't expect it to pick up immediately. There's a time lag, there's a sensitization phase, and there's a management phase to actually, and this is like a newborn baby. Now you have the baby, it's there. Now you have to nurture it until it can walk, right? So it's not like the launch came and this thing was 100% there. We had 6 weeks to do it, so a lot of shortcuts. So there was a necessity for a phase 2, which was to be put in place. I think, in my opinion, the phase 2 was put in a little bit slowly, but it's there now. So you would expect that people would pick it up eventually, but the sensitization has to be there. The initial pickup in the weeks leading to the launch was very good. The numbers that we were seeing on the website were fantastic. People were accessing the data, they were asking for new data sets, etc. And I think that is still continuing up to today. But the demand, the supply side of meeting those demands, I think that's where it took off a little bit slowly, because as the requests for data sets were coming, there was this need to take advantage of that to actually either develop them or point people to where they were so that the usage could happen. So I think we lost a little bit of an opportunity there, but a strategy has been adopted. I think things should be looking good so far. And as far as my own work is concerned, I've been using this data for everything since it has been launched. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Mombasa talking to the Northern Corridor Secretariat, and they want to build something called an observatory, which is basically data collection and analysis. And they were asking which are the best cases that you know about. And of course, my response was like, look at this. So I think the Northern Corridor Secretariat now, with its membership, will become a more keener user of that information, pick whatever they need for their own purposes. And wherever I've been going, I've actually been spreading that message. Whenever I talk to anyone I met, whether it's in the donor community, in the governments, if the topic ever comes around to data, I'm always selling the Open Data Initiative. That's the little bit that I've been doing on the side just on my own. Yeah. I think we are not the only country who are considering this open government and open data initiatives. I mean, we have cases in Tanzania recently, South Africa, Morocco. So people are finally trying to understand and are understanding what this is about. The opportunity, no doubt, is there. There is a reason why we are called the dark continent. It's because no one knows much about us. So we have to give out the info that we have. There's no doubt that the next, the largest pool of resources right now in the world lie right here at our feet. So how do we utilize them? We have our own issues. We have issues in health, agriculture, etc. How do we use this information to actually make our lives better? So opportunities abound, and they're slowly becoming more and more easier to see now that technology is moving, now that such initiatives are happening, etc. That's how I feel this whole thing is going.